The United States says that it has fully destroyed its decades-old stockpiles of chemical weapons, a milestone that has finally eliminated all known stores of the agents of mass death. The United States was the last of the signatories of the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1997 to complete the task of destroying their declared stockpiles. That being said, it is believed that some states maintain secret reserves of chemical weapons as well. How potent were these chemical weapons? What did this ordeal entail? To discuss this, we have with us Dr. Malcolm Davis, live from Canberra, Australia. He is a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Now, sir, the United States, as I mentioned, has destroyed the last of the chemical weapons, a 4-year job of eliminating some 500 tons of lethal chemical agents. What can you tell us about this?
Well, essentially, the US has fulfilled its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention to destroy all stockpiles of lethal chemical weapons, things like nerve agents, that sort of thing. And so the US is now in full compliance. But as you said in your intro, there are still other states that are not in full compliance. So we are nowhere near a world without chemical weapons.
Right, sir, for better understanding, what can you tell us about the mustard agent, the VX and the sarin agent, much of which were held inside rockets and other projectiles since the 1940s?
All of them are incredibly nasty in terms of their effects on humans. Certainly, VX and sarin are lethal very quickly. They kill by essentially paralyzing the nervous system. They can be ingested, obviously, through touch, but also breathing it in. And getting droplets on your skin. So when you see footage of soldiers in training, quite often they'll be wearing what's known as NBC suits, which are fully protective suits with gas masks to try and protect them from these sorts of agents. Mustard gas is not necessarily as lethal, but it can produce very serious effects on the body. And so all three of these agents are just some of the chemical agents that have been eliminated by the United States under the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Right, sir. Could you also take us through the process here? What does destroying an entire category of declared weapons of mass destruction truly entail?
Essentially, with chemical weapons, you have to incinerate them. And that requires a large furnace where you very carefully empty the chemical weapon agent into the furnace, because you cannot sort of spill any or let any released into the atmosphere, because it is instantly lethal. So it is a very complex process. It has to be monitored by US and international authorities under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the furnace breaks down the molecular structure of the chemical agent so that it's destroyed.
Right. Now, that being said, would you say the threat of chemical weapons is behind us? As I mentioned, and you did too, it is believed that some states maintain secret reserves of chemical weapons.
It's certainly not behind us, and I think some states don't even bother with making it secret. The Russians, for example, have chemical weapons capabilities in direct violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, including sarin, VX, and also Novichok, which is a much more lethal version of nerve agent, even more so than VX. The North Koreans have a massive chemical weapons program. Syrians have a chemical weapons program. They've used chemical weapons extensively on civilian populations. And there's suspicions about the Chinese and also Myanmar. So, as I said, we're a long way away from a world without chemical weapons. There are states that either maintain secret programs or maintain overt programs that are not in compliance with their obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Right, so that being said, what sort of mechanisms do you think are required to be introduced to make sure that such chemical weapons are not used?
Well, I think that it's difficult to deter use. That red line was breached by the Syrians in collaboration with the Russians in Syria, where they used chemical weapons in 2014. The Obama administration had set a red line that if you use chemical weapons, there'll be retaliation. There was no retaliation. And so therefore that essentially that guardrail, that deterrent against use of chemical weapons, I think is dramatically weakened as a result of the failure of the Obama administration to respond. So there is concern now that chemical weapons could be used again. Certainly the Russians have used chemical weapons as an assassination tool. They've used Novichok for that. And so the concern would have to be that in current and future conflicts, for example, in Ukraine, the Russians might see chemical weapons use as an option short of tactical nuclear weapons, as an option that they could do to get away with it rather than seeing a NATO conventional response. It's very difficult to deter use of chemical weapons. All you can really do is threaten military retaliation. But if you don't carry out that military retaliation, then it's an empty threat.
Right, sir. Now, the completion of this process essentially underscores that these types of weapons, by this the United States, I'd say, has underscored that these types of weapons are no longer acceptable in the battlefield. And this comes on the heels of the announcement of a package of cluster munitions by the United States to Ukraine, a weapon that 2/3 of the NATO countries have banned because it can cause many civilian casualties. Could you draw the distinction for us between these two?
Look, I think cluster munitions are a nasty weapon. They do generate a greater risk of indiscriminate casualties. Certainly, depending on the way they're used, they could be a threat to civilians. I think that the US provision of cluster munitions, the DPICM weapon to Ukraine, is in response to Russian use of cluster munitions extensively against civilians, and also thermobaric weapons against civilians. So this is trying to essentially give Ukraine some chance of successfully completing its counteroffensive that it's currently going slowly with. And I think that obviously Ukraine would be seeking to avoid deliberately targeting civilians, unlike the Russians, which have deliberately targeted civilians with cluster munitions. So I think that it's a bad weapon. There's no good weapons, but I think on the circumstances, we cannot afford to have Ukraine defeated or see their counteroffensive fail. So that's why the Biden administration has decided to provide them with these particular weapons.
Right. Now, that being said, what can you tell us of the true extent, just for better understanding, of the death and devastation that a chemical weapon can cause? And as you also mentioned, that the threat is not behind us. Are there similar weapons in arsenals across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, sort of chemical weapons, if used on the battlefield or used against urban areas, could cause mass casualties. The Iraqis use chemical weapons at Halabja and caused tens of thousands of dead. The Syrians, with Russian connivance, used chemical weapons in Syria in 2014 and caused thousands of casualties. And the nature of the chemical weapons are such that, the casualties are quite horrendous. There's also biological weapons that we have to be worried about. And countries like Russia, China, North Korea all have active biological weapons programs, which are even more lethal in many respects. So I do think we need to be very sanguine and realistic about the prospects here. I think that the US compliance of its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention by destroying these weapons is a good step forward. But I don't think we're anywhere near a situation where we can sit down and be comfortable and relaxed about the threat posed by chemical or biological weapons.
All right. Well, Dr. Malcolm Davis, thank you so much for joining us on WION with your insights and inputs on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.